My panel in studio this evening, security analyst Rafael Yerushalmi, former IDF senior intelligence officer Dan Perry, international affairs analyst and former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, and I-24 News correspondent Zach Anders. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining me here in studio this evening. Rafael, Dan, I want to get your assessments here. We've spoken for months now of this cautious optimism. The Israeli negotiating team is already back from Doha. The Prime Minister has now issued a team for follow-up talks next week. Are you optimistic? What is this signal for you? Perhaps, Dan, you can begin the conversation.
To me, the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah are speaking and putting out, as Zach called it, committal noises, is certainly cause for some optimism. I think we're seeing potentially a moving of the needle. You know, originally we thought the only thing possible was a partial deal for some of the hostages because Israel won't end the war and Hamas won't release all the hostages. Then it started to look like the only thing possible is all the hostages for an end to the war. So Israel was refusing, although Biden suggested it wasn't. Now what we're seeing, apparently, is an agreement on a first stage that would be a partial deal for a temporary ceasefire of 6 months, with a second stage to be negotiated, meaning if the reports are true, Hamas has dropped its demand for a promise to end the war before the first stage is implemented, which should include 30-some elderly, infirm hostages and the young women. So that's progress.
Okay.
Yes, optimism indeed. Something is happening, is moving. We don't know exactly what. Mostly a play on words, so some words have been changed and now they seem to satisfy the parties. This deal is a very bad deal. This was a bad deal from the start. 3 phases, sub-phases, discussion during the phases, in between the phases. I mean, so many things can go wrong when you speak of 6 months truce. It will never last.
6 weeks.
6 weeks, sorry, 6 weeks truce. It will never last. It will never hold. A lot of things can go wrong. And it would have been much better. First of all, it's nice to hear of a first phase and possibly, maybe, some hostages being liberated, even though I'm not sure what the Hamas has to gain from that. But let's say yes, but that will be for sure at the expense of all the other hostages that are not liberated then what do we have as an asset to gain their liberation? That's the problem. I just will finish by saying we should only accept a global deal, 120 hostages, and now. Meaning what? Let's just lie, let's just bluff. I mean, what happened to Israeli chutzpah? Let's just say that we agree to a ceasefire, complete ceasefire. We get out of Gaza. The chief of the IDF, Herzl Levy, said, we can do it, we can do it. When we had the first liberation of hostages, we had a very long ceasefire. People thought, oh, that's it, we stopped our attack. How are we going to start the attack again? 1 minute after that ceasefire was finished, the IDF was back on track, back all over Gaza attacking. So we can do it. Let's accept it. Let's just get the whole of them, the 120 hostages, no sub-phase, third phase, second phase. And once the last of the hostages is back in Israel, we attack. We do not respect the agreement. We don't have to respect any agreement with a terrorist faction and give our promises. It's very, very dangerous to accept what is being offered to us now.
But you're getting some of the hostages, and the leverage that Israel would have after the first 6-week stage would be, just as you suggest, the resumption of the war. I think in the end, to get all the hostages back, and this is what you say is your preference, and it's everyone's preference, but it may not be possible. What might eventually be inescapable is that to get the last of the hostages back, Israel will indeed have to end the war. And I've been predicting that for months and suggesting that the war can always be resumed if Hamas gives Israel any pretext to resume it, but then Israel will be operating without one hand or two hands tied behind its back because there will be no more hostages.
Yes, but with the difference that these hostages, they've got no time left. I don't know how many of them are alive. And I think by the time all these truce and this and that and the other, they will be all dead.
That's the argument why Israel might have to accept
one has to remember
cessation of the war.
Yeah, but we have to. Our responsibility is to liberate all the hostages.
And
I'm very happy to see a few coming back, but it's not right. We have to liberate them all. But at the end of the game, when in the history books they will speak of the war on the 7th of October, you can kill all the Sinwars that you want. and you can liberate some hostages, it will not be a victory.
So here's
the
a
only
question.
victory will be all the hostages back home.
Understood. But if that were available today, as I suspect it is, if Israel could get all the hostages back today in exchange for a departure from Gaza and an end to the war, leaving Hamas perhaps bowed but unbeaten, would you accept that?
Yes, yes, of course, because we can get to them later. Hamas can wait. We've waited 20 years.
Yeah.
20 years we let Hamas operate and threaten us and throw missiles at us. So we wait another couple of years. But we cannot afford 2 minutes more
I agree.
the hostages being held, but all of them. Because honestly, I'm telling you, I'm afraid to say that liberating some hostages will be at the expense of the others, and the others might never see home again if we are too quick at accepting these conditions.
We here
It's
can
too
agree.
quick.
We here can agree, but the Prime Minister does not, because that involves an end to the war, and what we're seeing is a categorical refusal.
Gentlemen, I want to interject you for a second. As you mentioned, Netanyahu told Biden Israel is committed to ending the war in Gaza only after achieving all of its goals. We know from the beginning of this war that started with the October 7th massacres that there's 2 goals to this war. One is to bring home the hostages. The second is to dismantle Hamas in Gaza, at least militarily. You, Rafael, I want to ask you, in terms of where we stand right now with the military campaign in Gaza, what will be the official sign that Hamas has been dismantled? Can you tell us at this point where things stand, and can we assume that Hamas is close to being dismantled?
The only objective we have attained so far is dismantling what the Hamas army, what you call an army, battalions, brigades, chain of command. The Hamas still is a threat, a military threat, but it's not an army anymore. Many cells are operating independently. All the battalions on infrastructure that makes it an army has been dismantled and destroyed. This being said, we're far from a victory, far, first of all, because thousands of terrorists are still alive and at large. And second of all, and much more important, we haven't made any plan for what to do after that. So the Hamas is still the only alternative. They're still the administrator. Who is administrating today the Gaza Strip? The Hamas. We haven't got new civil servants. We haven't got new cops. We haven't got any replacement. So we haven't achieved anything. We just have achieved one military option, which is only a certain phase of that military option. A lot of work still to be done, cleaning up, etc. But if we do not take a very quick decision, it should have been taken 3 months ago, right? But let's say right now, to accept, for instance, the proposal from the Saudis and Egyptians to bring an international, who cares? We have the same, except whoever wants to take this hot potato, give it to him. Let's just close the door, throw the key, bye-bye. But unfortunately, no decision has been taken. The same as for the hostages, there is a problem at the political level that things are not moving. There is no green light. There is no clear-cut decision. And unfortunately, the professional level and the security level, they are willing to do all these things. They're willing to retreat. They are willing to liberate hostages. They are willing to have an international force and prepare the ground for the international force. All this is ready on the ground. So what we are now waiting for is a decision.
And we'll get to the political aspect in just a second. Zach, I want to ask you, Hamas has reportedly informed Hezbollah that it has agreed to a potential ceasefire in Gaza. Is this an attempt to sort of change the optics and place the ball in Netanyahu's court?
Well, certainly you would think so, especially given that this is a statement that's being made with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, presumably in secret somewhere, this Nasrallah meeting that's taking place. But the fact that they're publicizing and speaking in a bit more committal terms than we've heard, Nasrallah, through one of his deputies, saying, we will stop at the exact hour that you agree to a ceasefire in Hamas and will end the fire from northern Israel, or on northern Israel. I think if you take a step back and you look at the movement that's been taking place between Hamas and Hezbollah in the last week, they've said that they've met multiple times and that they've been performing more of their communication, what's the word I'm looking for, where they're the coordination with the axis of resistance, and that this is still something of a partnership between the two. Is that a threat necessarily? Not one that Israel's not used to, but the last week has been some pretty high rhetoric. And then to see today them say, well, at the same time, you accept this deal. I think it's interesting timing.
Dan, the National Unity Party chairman, Benny Gans, has reportedly called Prime Minister Netanyahu this evening, offering his full backing in return for a possible deal. We're seeing some sort of cooperation between the opposition and the coalition here, or at least Netanyahu. What does that signal to you? And do you think that given the pressure that Netanyahu is facing from the hostage families and knowing that he potentially has this backing, that he will take that card from Gans?
I think the only pressure that works on Netanyahu is that from people who can bring down his coalition, specifically the far right, and the far right insistence on what has been the strategy to date is the very reason why, as Raphael has said, there is no day after plan in Gaza. There has to date not been a deal, partial or full, for the hostages. At the end of the day, of course, Benny Gantz and the entire opposition and most of the people of Israel support this deal. But it requires Sinwar and Netanyahu, essentially, and that's what we're waiting for.
Right.
The fact that the government has stood in the way of allowing an alternative to Hamas to emerge in the Gaza Strip is what guarantees that if Israel leaves, Hamas will be in charge in the Gaza Strip. And the fact that they will be able to impose their will on the poor people of Gaza reflects the failure, ultimately, to truly dismantle their fighting force.
Do you think that's where the hang-up is right now with the negotiations? Because we heard earlier today that Hamas rejecting any other form of leadership inside.
Yeah, but I mean, in insisting that they stay in power in Gaza, they have a strange, unspoken ally, Netanyahu. This is the infuriating and outrageous thing that I think much of the public in Israel is starting to understand, but that largely goes unspoken. There are a number of alternatives to Hamas in Gaza, and if you allow the alternatives to come in, they could take part in subduing what's left of Hamas in Gaza, but the government won't hear of it. And the reason for that is quite clearly the extreme right that has blackmail power in Netanyahu.
All right, gentlemen, stay with me. I want to move on to